Imagine you are standing on a high mountain peak looking back through a telescope that can see through time itself. Directly below you, the world is a hum of electricity, satellites, and humming servers. But as you turn the dial back, the lights of cities vanish, towering skyscrapers melt into stone temples, and the very map of our world begins to shift like sand in the wind. Since the dawn of organized society, there has almost always been one seat at the head of the table, one civilization that stood taller, richer, and more influential than all the others combined. But no one stays at the top forever. The history of the world is a relay race where the baton is passed from one empire to the next, often through the friction of innovation, trade, or the sheer weight of ambition. Today, we are embarking on a journey through 3,500 years of human history to identify the strongest country in every single century from 1500 BC all the way to the present day. We aren't just looking at who had the biggest walls or the shiniest armor, but who controlled the flow of wealth, who defined the culture of their era, and whose decisions shaped the fate of everyone else on the planet. This is the story of humanity's search for the ultimate peak and how every titan eventually finds its successor. We begin our journey in the 15th century BC, around 1500 years before the Common Era. If you were looking for the center of the world at this moment, your eyes would immediately land on the Nile River. This is the era of the New Kingdom of Egypt. Under powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, Egypt was the undisputed superpower. They had perfected the Bronze Age technology of the chariot, creating a military force that no neighbor could hope to match. But it wasn't just about strength. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Their surplus of grain allowed them to build monuments that still baffle us today, and their influence stretched from the depths of Africa up into modern-day Syria. In 1500 BC, to be Egyptian was to be at the pinnacle of human achievement. Moving into the 14th century BC, Egypt remains the dominant force, reaching its absolute peak of cultural splendor. This is the age of Amenhotep III and later the famous Ramses II. Gold flowed into the treasury from the mines of Nubia, and the diplomatic letters found by archaeologists show that every other king in the Near East referred to the pharaoh as their father or brother. It was a time of relative stability where Egypt's word was law across the eastern Mediterranean. But by the 13th century BC, a new challenger had fully emerged to the north, the Hittite Empire. Based in modern-day Turkey, the Hittites were the masters of ironworking and heavy chariotry. The clash between the Egyptians and the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh was effectively the first world war of recorded history. While the battle ended in a stalemate, the Hittites proved that Egypt was no longer the sole titan. For much of this century, the Hittites held the strategic advantage, controlling the vital trade routes of the Levant and pushing the boundaries of what a centralized state could accomplish. As we reach the 12th century BC, the world experiences a mysterious and massive shift known as the Bronze Age collapse. Great empires crumbled. But out of the chaos, the Middle Assyrian Empire began its slow, grinding climb to power. While other civilizations were retreating behind their walls, the Assyrians were refining a culture of total dedication to the state and their god, Ashur. They began to implement a professionalized administration that would become the blueprint for every empire that followed. By the 11th century BC, the momentum shifted toward the east, specifically to the Zhou dynasty in China. This is the century where the Zhou overthrew the Shang and established the concept of the mandate of heaven. This idea, that a ruler only has the right to lead if they are just and effective, would govern Chinese politics for nearly 3,000 years. The Zhou created a feudal system that allowed for massive agricultural expansion, making them the most populous and organized society on the planet at the time. In the 10th century BC, we return to the Near East, where the Neo-Assyrian Empire began its truly terrifying ascent. Under a series of energetic kings, they moved away from being a regional power to becoming a true machine of expansion. They were the first to use iron weapons on a massive, standardized scale. They didn't just win battles, they reorganized entire populations to serve the needs of the capital. In terms of sheer raw influence and the ability to project power, the 10th century BC belonged to the men of Nineveh. The 9th century BC continued this Assyrian dominance. They were the masters of siegecraft, able to take down any walled city that dared to resist. Their library at Nineveh became the greatest collection of knowledge in the world. At a time when much of Europe was still in small tribal clusters, the Assyrians were running a complex multinational state that collected tribute from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. By the 8th century BC, the Assyrian grip was at its tightest. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, they created the world's first standing professional army. No longer did they rely on farmers who had to go home for the harvest. They had soldiers who did nothing but train, move, and execute the will of the king. They were the apex predators of the 8th century, and their administrative innovations allowed them to rule over a diverse array of cultures with an iron fist. The 7th century BC marks the final glorious burst of Assyria before a spectacular fall, but for most of those 100 years they were still the titans. However, toward the end of the century, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by figures like Nebuchadnezzar, took the mantle. Babylon became the largest and most magnificent city in the world, famous for its blue-tiled gates and legendary hanging gardens. They inherited the Assyrian mantle of power, but added a layer of architectural and astronomical splendor that made them the envy of the known world. Then, in the 6th century BC, the world saw the rise of the first true global superpower, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Founded by Cyrus the Great, Persia did something no one else had managed. They ruled with a degree of tolerance. Instead of erasing the cultures they conquered, they incorporated them. By the end of this century, the Persian Empire stretched from India to the edges of Greece and down into Egypt. They built the Royal Road, a highway system that allowed messages to travel thousands of miles in days. In the 6th century BC, there was Persia, and then there was everyone else. The 5th century BC is often remembered for the rise of the Greek city-states, but in terms of overall strength, the Persian Empire was still the giant on the map. Despite their setbacks at Marathon and Salamis, the Persians remained the wealthiest and most influential state, often acting as the puppet masters of Greek politics by funding whichever city-state suited their interests. Their gold was just as powerful as their spears. In the 4th century BC, a young man from the fringes of the Greek world changed everything. Alexander the Great led the kingdom of Macedon on a campaign that dismantled the Persian Empire in just over a decade. For a brief, shining moment, Macedon was the strongest country in the world, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. Alexander's conquest spread Greek culture, language, and thought across 3 continents, creating a Hellenistic world that would influence history for centuries. The 3rd century BC sees the rise of 2 massive powers on opposite ends of the globe. In the East, the Qin dynasty unified China for the first time, ending centuries of internal conflict and beginning the construction of the Great Wall. In the West, the Roman Republic defeated its great rival, Carthage, in the Punic Wars. While the Qin were arguably more centralized and populous, the sheer military resilience of Rome was beginning to make it the dominant force in the Mediterranean. By the 2nd century BC, the Han dynasty in China had taken the foundation laid by the Qin and turned it into a golden age. The Han were the first to establish the Silk Road, connecting the East to the West through trade. Simultaneously, Rome was expanding into Greece and Asia Minor. If you had to pick the strongest, the Han dynasty's balance of economic wealth, massive population, and advanced bureaucracy likely gave them the edge as the world's premier superpower. The 1st century BC belongs to the Roman Republic, transitioning into the Roman Empire. This was the century of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Rome had no more equals in the West. They controlled the entire Mediterranean, which they called Mare Nostrum, or RC. Their engineering, from aqueducts to concrete, allowed them to build a civilization that was centuries ahead of its time. As we enter the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire reaches its Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and immense strength. Under emperors like Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. No other country could match Rome's ability to move legions across continents or its sophisticated legal and economic systems. The 2nd century was the continuation of the Roman and Han Golden Ages. However, as the century progressed, the Han dynasty began to face internal pressures that Rome, for the moment, was better equipped to handle. The Roman Empire under the 5 good emperors represented the height of human organization in the West, providing a level of stability that wouldn't be seen again for 1,000 years. By the 3rd century, both Rome and China were struggling with internal instability, but the Sassanid Persian Empire emerged as a brilliant and powerful successor to the old Persian glory. They were the primary rivals to Rome, often defeating Roman legions in the field and capturing Roman emperors. Their heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, were the tanks of the ancient world. In the 4th century, the Gupta Empire in India entered its golden age. While the Roman Empire was splitting into East and West, the Guptas were overseeing a revolution in science, mathematics, and art. They developed the concept of zero and calculated the length of a solar year with incredible accuracy. India was the intellectual and economic powerhouse of this century. The 5th century was a time of massive migration and upheaval in Europe, but in the East, the Northern Wei and other dynasties kept China moving forward. However, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome, managed to survive the chaos that claimed the West. Under the right leadership, they remained the most organized and wealthy state in the Mediterranean world. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire reached a new peak under Justinian the Great. He reclaimed much of the old Roman territory in Italy and North Africa and built the Hagia Sophia, the largest building in the world at the time. The Byzantines were the guardians of Roman law and Greek learning, and their gold salatus was the global reserve currency. The 7th century saw one of the most rapid and explosive shifts in history. The Rashidun and then the Umayyad caliphates emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. In just a few decades, they conquered Persia and stripped the Byzantines of their wealthiest provinces. By the end of the century, the Umayyad Caliphate was the largest empire the world had ever seen to that point, stretching from Spain to India. The 8th century belongs to the Tang dynasty in China. This was a true golden age of poetry, trade, and expansion. The Tang capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world and a melting pot of cultures. At the same time, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was leading the Islamic Golden Age, but the Tang's industrial output and population size made them the heavyweight of the 8th century. In the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate reached its zenith. Baghdad became the center of the world's knowledge, with the House of Wisdom attracting scholars from every continent. They controlled the vital trade routes between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Their influence on science and philosophy was unparalleled. The 10th century saw a resurgence of the Byzantine Empire under the Macedonian dynasty. They pushed back their rivals and restored their status as the premier power in the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, in the East, the Song dynasty was beginning to take shape, but the Byzantines' professional military and strategic central location gave them the most weight in global affairs. The 11th century was the era of the Song dynasty in China. This was a period that many historians describe as a pre-modern industrial revolution. The Song were using gunpowder, printing presses, and paper money long before the rest of the world. They had a standing navy and a civil service system based on merit. China was far and away the most advanced society on Earth. By the 12th century, the Khmer Empire in modern-day Cambodia was at its height, building the massive temple complex of Angkor Wat. However, the Song dynasty remained the economic heart of the world, despite losing territory to northern invaders. Their technology and trade continued to set the standard for what a civilization could achieve. The 13th century belongs to the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history. They were masters of mobile warfare and psychological tactics. They connected the East and West like never before, creating the Pax Mongolica, which allowed for a massive exchange of ideas, though the cost in human life was staggering. The 14th century saw the rise of the Ming dynasty in China, which overthrew the Mongols and restored Chinese rule. They built the Forbidden City and sent out the massive treasure fleets of Zheng He, which reached the shores of Africa. The Ming were a naval and economic powerhouse, showing the world that China was back at the top of the mountain. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire shocked the world by conquering Constantinople in 1453. This marked the end of the Middle Ages and the rise of a new titan. The Ottomans were the masters of gunpowder and artillery. They sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the spice trade and building a military that was feared across the Mediterranean. The 16th century was the Siglo de Oro, or the Golden Age of Spain. Fueled by the silver and gold flowing from the Americas, Spain became the first empire upon which the sun never set. Their infantry, the tercios, were considered invincible, and their navy dominated the Atlantic. Under Philip II, Spain was the global bank and the defender of the faith. By the 17th century, the focus shifted to the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic, through the Dutch East India Company, became the wealthiest nation on earth per capita. They controlled the world's shipping and established a global trade network that laid the foundations of modern capitalism. Their tiny nation used wealth and naval power to punch far above its weight class. The 18th century saw the rise of France under the Bourbon kings, particularly Louis XIV earlier on. But by the end of the century, the momentum was shifting toward the British Empire. However, for much of the 1700s, France was the cultural, military, and diplomatic center of Europe. French was the language of the elite from Moscow to Lisbon, and their army was the standard by which all others were measured. The 19th century was the century of the British Empire. Following the defeat of Napoleon, Britain had no rivals. The Industrial Revolution began in their factories, and the Royal Navy policed the world's oceans. At its height, the British Empire ruled over a quarter of the world's land and population. They were the world's factory, its banker and its policeman. The 20th century was the American century. Following the two world wars, the United States emerged as the world's economic and military titan. The technological revolution, the internet, and the dominance of the dollar made the US the first true hyperpower. Especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, American culture, from movies to music, spanned the globe. And now, in the 21st century, we find ourselves in an era of intense competition. The United States remains the most powerful military force and the leader in high-tech innovation, but China has returned to the world stage as an economic giant, reminiscent of its Tang and Song glory days. The baton is moving, but for now, the system established in the late 20th century still places the US at the center. Looking back through the telescope, we see a pattern. Strength isn't just about how many soldiers you have. It's about how many people you can feed, how many ideas you can invent, and how efficiently you can move goods across the map. From the chariots of the Nile to the servers of Silicon Valley, the strongest country in every century has been the one that could harness the tools of its time to solve the problems of its neighbors, or impose its will upon them. Egypt, Persia, Rome, China, the Caliphates, the Mongols, Spain, Britain, and America. None of these powers were identical, but they all shared a common trait. They were the focus point of human activity during their reign. They were the places where the future was being built. As we move further into the 21st century, the question isn't just who will be the strongest next, but what kind of strength they will use. Will it be the strength of iron, the strength of gold, or the strength of information? History teaches us that the summit is always crowded, and the seat at the head of the table is never permanently reserved. The empires of the past are now ruins and chapters in textbooks, but their legacies live on in our languages, our laws, and our cities. We are the inheritors of 35 centuries of struggle and achievement. Each century had its titan, and each titan taught the world something new about what it means to be a global civilization. As the telescope of time continues to record our movements, we are the ones writing the current chapter. The strength of our century will be defined by how we handle the challenges of a truly connected planet. We are no longer isolated empires separated by vast deserts or oceans. We are a single, interconnected network where a ripple in one corner of the world is felt in every other. The baton is still in motion. The race continues. And while the names on the map will undoubtedly change, the human drive to reach the peak will always remain. It is the story that started in the mud of the Nile 1,500 years before the Common Era, and it is the story that will lead us into the stars in the centuries to come. Every titan falls, but every fall makes room for something new to grow. And that is perhaps the most powerful lesson history has to give us. Stay curious about our shared past, and keep watching the horizon of our future. The next century is already being decided by the choices we make today. Thank you for traveling through time with us. The world is a vast, complicated, and incredibly resilient place, and its history is the greatest story ever told. Keep exploring, stay engaged, and remember that we are all part of the same long bridge across the centuries. Until next time, keep your eyes on the map and your mind on the journey.